So, why is this guy a hero? Why is David Brainerd a hero? Because he gave his life to reach the Indians, Delaware Indians, on the Susquehanna, and he's dying of tuberculosis. And at one point, he stops and he makes comments and he says, "This is a work of God because I'm sick, because I don't speak the language very well, and it's not something that I did, but apparently that God did." And so he's a hero because David Brainerd is very reflective of his sin and his unworthiness. And so Jonathan Edwards calls that a indication of his real repentantness, of his real relationship with the Lord, that those who grow spiritually only realize their greater sinfulness. So I'm thinking of Martin Luther, and I'm thinking of Isaiah the prophet, but in his journals you see it. I wish I could use my time better. If people knew who I really was, would they support me as a missionary? And so it's really there. So it's interesting that he wins a powwow to the Lord, and so Jonathan Edwards calls these guys wizards, and he's traveling, and one is with him, and that another powwow threatens them and says he's going to curse them if they don't leave, and this former powwow says that it won't work against him, and that if he would really just get an idea of the power of the Word of God, he would leave the powwow stuff behind. And I thought that was interesting. And when that powwow in that story gets saved, the one that was on David Brainerd's side, he had killed somebody and done some bad things, and so he says this thing that Brainerd and other converts in the book said, and that's if God sends me to hell, I deserve it. If God sends me to hell, he'll be just. And the wizard is saying, I'm going to go to hell. I can't change my heart. I can't turn to Christ. And so Brainerd's like, well, why are you coming to hear more about Christ? Well, I want other Indians to come to know Christ, but I can't. And so he wanted to be there. He wanted to learn more about Christ. He wanted to be with Christians, but he thought he was too wicked for the Lord to save him, or to change, for his heart to change. And so I thought that was interesting. Jerusha was a sister that he goes to live with when he's 14. And Jerusha is Jonathan Edwards' daughter, who's 17 and cares for him at the end of his life. And she ends up dying 4 or 5 months after he does. And Jonathan Edwards writes this book and says they were so fortunate to have a missionary, a man of God, that would come and spend his last days with them, and they would be beneficiaries of his dying prayers and his dying wishes. And it's just amazing that Jonathan Edwards counts that a blessing, when in fact his daughter caught tuberculosis and died from caring for David Brainerd. And so I think that's interesting. Piper goes into detail about the history of what's happening, or what's happened there, and that Edwards and Brainerd were at the center of Yale becoming a bit stodgy, I would say. That's how I would put it. But that Brainerd said after a prayer at Yale by a tutor, he thought there was only a few people in the room. Someone else was outside. They said, "What did you think about that prayer?" He said, "Well, I think that man has as much of the grace of God as this chair." And so he was put out of Yale College. Piper says that that was God's providence, that he would have been able to become a pastor, but in Connecticut you couldn't become a pastor unless you graduated from Yale or one other university. And so instead he becomes a missionary to the Indians. Later on he gets offered a church in East Hampton, and Piper says that was a very wealthy church. And I think that's interesting because we still recognize the Hamptons as a place of wealth. And and it's interesting to hear the firsthand account of the Indians and what their circumstances were, and how, as they begin listening to the message of Christ, they build huts. He built with his own hands a hut in each place, in at least two places where he was ministering. But they build huts around him in order to hear the message. And at one point, they count it as providence that the Lord allows them to kill a couple deer close to where he's teaching. And so they build a village around him so they can hear the message of the Word of God. He gets stranded as he's moving through the woods a couple times, and he ends up sleeping out in the elements. One time he goes, and I thought it was interesting, he hollowed out a place in a pine tree to sleep. And I'm trying to figure out, what in the world does that mean? How does that work? And I thought about it and realized that when you get inside of a pine tree, or when you climb a pine tree, it's kind of a sheltered area inside the pine tree, and that's what he did. And so just the practicals of thinking about how things were in that time and that place make the book interesting as well.